right, hi everyone. I am going to go ahead and record the lecture for Thursday. So as you've probably already heard, the university has extended the virtual only classes at this point, at least until Thursday. So this is the lecture video for February 18th. So before we get into the material, a few announcements. One thing, remember that you do have exam 2 that's going to be opening right after our usual class period would end on Thursday, February 18th. And then it's going to be open for a week, so it'll close right before our class period starts next Thursday. So regardless of what's going on with the weather, we had already planned to not meet this upcoming Tuesday, which is the 23rd. Yeah. So we're not going to be meeting on the 23rd because I'm giving you that time to take the test if you would like. My plan is to kind of briefly mention the test a little bit at the end of the lecture video for today. But if you're a student who receives accommodations, I set up the accommodations for exam 2 the same way I set them up for exam 1. If you need something different, please let me know. Also, as far as announcements go, remember that activity 5 is going to be closing at the end of the day on Thursday, February 18th. Activity 5 was the one that we had talked about with women using substances during pregnancy. So make sure that you get that activity response in. And then activity 6 was one that we had talked about as part of Tuesday's lecture, Tuesday the 16th. So that activity asked for you to give some examples of appetitive behaviors in humans. So that activity is going to be open for a week, so it's going to close at the end of the day on February 23rd, which is that next Tuesday. I'll send out an email with all this information in it so you guys have the latest updates. If you have questions about any of this, please feel free to let me know. Now, in our last lecture video, we finished up Chapter 7 and we started talking about Chapter 12. So first we talked a little bit about sexual behavior, and then we started talking about this process of sexual differentiation. So here we're talking about a few different components: genetic sex, gonadal sex, and phenotypic sex. And this is where we kind of finished off last time. So genetic sex is referring to your chromosomes. So an individual who has XY chromosomes would then have an SRY gene as part of that Y chromosome. The SRY gene would lead to the generic gonad turning into a testis, right? Singular for testes. And then the testes would start to produce hormones. So the testes would produce testosterone and anti-Mullerian hormone. Now, the testosterone causes the Wolffian system to develop. So these would be considered the male ducts. And the anti-Mullerian hormone causes the Mullerian system to fade away. The female ducts then disintegrate. So now we have the gonads, you have testes, you have the testosterone that is masculinizing the inner tubing system, and then we need the external genitalia. So for that, you need this enzyme 5-alpha reductase to take regular testosterone and convert it into the more potent form DHT that allows for the production of the male external genitalia, so penis and scrotum. On the other hand, if an individual has XX chromosomes, then they don't have a Y chromosome, so there is no SRY gene. Without an SRY gene, then the indifferent gonads develop into ovaries. The ovaries do not produce anti-Mullerian or testosterone. So because there is no anti-Mullerian, then the Mullerian system would develop. So the female duct system develops, and then because there is no testosterone to cause the Wolffian system to develop, then the Wolffian system fades away. Also, there's no significant amount of testosterone to be converted into DHT. So then we don't have that masculinization of the external genitalia. So the individual would develop vagina, clitoris, etc. Okay, so that's sort of a summary of what we talked about towards the end of class on Tuesday's video anyway. Now, picking up with some new information here, we've been talking sort of about the typical case, about how an individual has 2 sex chromosomes, right? Biological mom gives an X. Biological dad can either give an X or a Y. Now, with Turner syndrome, we have a person who only has 1 sex chromosome. a single X. Now, you have to have at least the single X in order to be viable. So if there was an embryo that did not have at least a single X, then that would not be a viable embryo. So with Turner syndrome, there are several different ways this can happen. The general idea is that you only have one full functioning sex chromosome. Sometimes the other sex chromosome is completely absent, or perhaps it's damaged in some way. So this individual does not have a Y chromosome. So without the Y chromosome, there is no SRY gene, which means that the indifferent gonads would not develop into testes, they would develop into ovaries instead. And so that process would then continue in that female direction. But because you're lacking some genetic material here, there are some different problems that can occur. Usually individuals who have Turner syndrome tend to have less growth, so a lower height. Also, they can have issues as far as like puberty goes, so not beginning a menstrual cycle or an irregular menstrual cycle. Typically, women who have Turner syndrome are not able to become pregnant. Sometimes it is possible with help for a woman to become pregnant here, but definitely difficult, and in some cases not possible. So infertility, there can be psychological issues, ADHD, learning disabilities, that sort of thing, as well as other physical issues as well. All right, another example of a situation that progresses a little bit differently here, congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So this is a situation where an individual has XX chromosomes. So no Y chromosome, so no SRY gene. So the indifferent gonads develop into ovaries as opposed to testes. So far, typical. But what happens next is that even though this individual does not have testes, there is still a high amount of testosterone that is produced, not from the gonads, but actually from adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands are supposed to be releasing corticosteroids, and instead, in these individuals, androgens are produced. So androgens sort of being a general term for male sex hormones. And with androgens being produced, then there is a masculinization here. Now, because there is no SRY gene, we don't have testes, so there's not as much testosterone as would typically be present in a male. So this individual would likely develop an intersex appearance, so external genitals that are similar to male genitals in some way, similar to females in another way, so sort of an in-between appearance there. Now, because this individual does not have a Y chromosome, there would be no testes, so ovaries are typically normal. But as you can imagine, there would be issues here with fertility. But beyond issues with fertility, oftentimes these individuals can be fairly healthy. And we'll talk a little bit more about some outcomes for them as we talk about this nature-nurture issue coming up shortly. Okay? So this is a situation where an individual has XX chromosomes, but they are partially masculinized by androgens that are produced by adrenal glands as opposed to testes. Okay, so that happens in individuals who have XX chromosomes. But here's a situation where an individual has XY chromosomes. So what happens here, we have androgen insensitivity syndrome. This is a situation where a person has a Y chromosome, therefore there is an SRY gene, therefore the indifferent gonads develop into testes. The testes produce testosterone. So far, progressing in a typical fashion. However, the issue is that the receptors for testosterone are not functioning, which means that the testosterone is not able to do its work. Even though there is testosterone in this person's system, it's not able to bind to receptors, so it's not able to masculinize the individual. So then this person would have testes, but the testes would not descend, so they would remain internal. And then as far as external appearance, these individuals would probably appear as female. So there's also some things that can happen at puberty. This individual is likely to develop breast tissue. So breast tissue develops in response to kind of a balance between testosterone and estrogen, having more estrogen than you have testosterone can cause breast tissue to form. So for these individuals, even though they have testosterone, it's not able to do its work. It's not able to bind to the receptors. So that can lead to breast tissue developing. So these individuals have the appearance that would typically be associated with a female, even though they have the chromosomes that are XY. All right, now here's another situation. Now all of these are relatively rare disorders, this one in particular. And this is where usually every semester I have to get a student to help me because I'm just not super confident in my Spanish at all. Okay, I took French in high school and in college. I'm doing some Latin with my kids. I don't do Spanish. But if I can remember from past students, webidoses, I don't know. That's somewhere close to the pronunciation here. Okay, so this is a disorder that is fairly rare, but there is a village in the Dominican Republic where there is a documented genetic predisposition. So there are more cases of this particular situation in this village than in other locations. So a lot of the research has come from the individuals who are in this particular area. So with this, which the local people refer to as webidoses, this is a problem with the enzyme 5-alpha reductase. So this is where a person would have XY chromosomes. So you have the Y chromosome, so you have an SRY gene. The SRY gene leads to the indifferent gonads developing into testes. The testes produce testosterone. So far, everything is functioning as expected. But then they don't have this enzyme that is needed to take that testosterone and convert it into its more potent form. So that we have testes, we have testosterone, but without the DHT, the more potent testosterone, then the external genitalia are not fully masculinized. So there's an intersex appearance here at birth. So in this particular culture, of course, there are many different ways that this situation could be handled. But in this particular culture, where it's not unheard of, there is a genetic predisposition that's in the area, what people typically do here is view the individual as a female from birth. But then when you hit puberty, even though the individual still lacks the 5-alpha reductase to convert testosterone into DHT, when you hit puberty here, the testes start producing a higher level of testosterone. And so the masculinization does progress to a certain extent, so that somewhere around puberty, the individual starts to take on more of a masculine appearance in the external genitals. The way that your textbook describes this, I believe, was a small but functional penis there. So these individuals are typically viewed as female until they reach puberty, and then at that point, they are often treated as males. We're going to have that conversation about nature and nurture in just a second, or in a few slides, so we'll come back to this in a little bit. Okay, so certainly this is a very complex issue. And certainly we can make this distinction between sex being more biological and gender being more influenced by the environment, by culture, by social norms. So when we're talking about this pattern of development, there is a fairly consistent pattern here with chromosomes, gonads, genitalia, etc. We can go through that chart of what happens with XY and what happens with XX. On the other hand, trying to identify behaviors as being more male or female is much more difficult. So one thing that we should bear in mind here is that when we do research to try to find psychological sorts of differences between males and females, we don't often find large differences. So, and of course, there's going to be wide individual variation. Even if we were to say that males and females differ on average in some characteristic, that number, that difference would probably be fairly small. When we're looking at behavior, your textbook talks about how the only behavior displayed exclusively by one sex is childbirth. So females give birth or are capable of giving birth. So that might start to open up some questions here then. Are there some behaviors other than childbirth that we typically associate with only one sex? The other one that usually students mention when I ask this question is breastfeeding. So I have had to do a little bit of research on this, and as surprising as this might sound, it is apparently possible for men to breastfeed. Now, let that sink in for a second. The thought is that this was very rare, so we don't have a lot of research on this, and probably would not be done in situations where there were other options. But if there's a infant that needs feeding and food is scarce, then it is possible. Basically, it's also possible for a woman who has not given birth to breastfeed as well. So if there's enough stimulation, you can get a breast pump. And if there's enough stimulation, then breast milk would be produced by either male or female. Now, I don't think there's a lot of research into the nutritional value of male breast milk, but it is technically possible. So just throwing that out there, you learn something new every day. Okay, so when we're talking about behaviors being different between men and women, then we might look at differences in the brain. And one overarching theory here is that the same hormones that are directing the sexual differentiation process may also be the ones that are impacting the development of the nervous system as well. So in other words, testosterone is not just producing external genitalia in men. It's also causing changes in the brain. So this is an organizational effect, which is contrasted with an activational effect. Last class, during the last video, I talked about an activational effect, where if you take a male mouse who has been castrated, so he does not have the use of his testes any longer, and then you inject him with testosterone, he will regain interest in sexual activity for the amount of time that the testosterone is in his system, and then after that, he would lose that interest again. So that's an activational effect because it's a temporary response to that injection. An organizational effect, there is a response that is not temporary, it's relatively permanent. So the thought is that the hormones that are masculinizing the body would also masculinize the brain as well in a permanent way. Now, in order for this organizational effect to happen, then the steroids, the hormones here, would have to be present during a sensitive period. So we mentioned sensitive period in chapter 7, the idea that this is a time when something that's coming in the environment can cause a permanent change. So we talked about how if with dogs, if they sew one eye shut during a sensitive period and then they remove the stitches later, then that animal might not have the use of that eye. They lost that because they were not having the normal environmental visual experiences during that sensitive period. Well, the same thing goes here as well. We're saying that there's a sensitive period, and if the individual is exposed to high levels of testosterone during that sensitive period, that causes a masculinization of not just the body, but of the brain as well. On the other hand, if the sensitive period has already passed, then you take an individual that's already developed and give them testosterone. Then you might see an activational effect. There might be a short-term effect as a result of the testosterone, but not a long-term effect here. So then the question is, when is the sensitive period? So when is that time when an individual may be permanently changed by levels of testosterone? Well, it depends on which species you're talking about. So your textbook talks about different rodents and things, and some of them have to have that testosterone in utero, so in the uterus, and then some of them have to have that testosterone given right after. And then also, for some individuals, there's a second sensitive period around puberty. So when we think about humans, of course, it's a little bit more complicated in humans, as is everything. But the idea is that there's a sensitive period during pregnancy, but there are also other sensitive periods, maybe especially during puberty, when having that increase in testosterone or not having an increase in testosterone also has a potential permanent effect, right? An organizational effect. Okay, now if you guys have questions about any of this, please feel free to email me, or you can include them when you type up your activity response. I can answer questions there as well. Okay, so the idea here is that the human body is sort of naturally female unless it's acted upon by male sex hormones. So androgens, testosterone being an example of that. So if during a sensitive period, the individual is not exposed to testosterone, then you have more of a feminine developmental tract happening. On the other hand, if you have testosterone that is present during this sensitive period, then that causes a more masculine developmental path to happen. So this organizational hypothesis is the idea that there is a relatively permanent change in the brain and in the body because of the presence or absence of androgens, specifically testosterone. So we're talking about what would be considered male sex hormones here, that they're masculinizing not just the genitals, not just the body, but also the brain specifically. And if we masculinize the brain, then that can lead to behavior patterns as well. Now, of course, a lot of this research is done in animals, and most research animals are rats. So I take out a lot of the stuff that your textbook has on research on animals. But here, leaving this in here, what they've done with rats is they have experimented with whether they're exposed to androgens during a sensitive period. So they identify that sensitive period, and then they either give them the testosterone during that time or they withhold the testosterone during that time. And what they found is that if you expose a rat to androgens during that sensitive period, they have male typical behaviors continuing on throughout life, regardless of whether the rat is male or female. As far as like biologically speaking, they have more male behaviors later. So if you took a female rat and exposed her to androgens during a sensitive period, she would typically express male behaviors. When we're looking at rats who have not been exposed to androgens during that sensitive period, they typically express what are considered more female behaviors in rats, regardless of whether it was a male rat or a female rat that we were doing the research on. Now, you may be asking yourself, what do I mean by male and female rat behaviors? There could be a few potential examples here, but most of these have to do with mounting behaviors. So we tend to see mounting behaviors in rats who have been exposed to testosterone during a sensitive period, regardless of whether it is a male or female rat, versus a more, what is the right term here? Well, more of a receptive posture. I don't know. It's really hard to talk about rats and their sexual positions, but you get the idea here. If they're not exposed to androgens, then they would tend to express more of what we would typically see in female rats. Okay, now let's think a little bit more about how this process works. So we're saying that the presence or absence of testosterone during a sensitive period leads to an individual either being masculinized or not. That's a general idea, but there's a little bit more to it because it's actually not so much the testosterone that's doing the masculinization as it is the estrogen. Sounds kind of weird, but follow with me here. There's this process, aromatization, where you have this enzyme, aromatase, that's converting testosterone to estradiol, which is a specific type of estrogen. So we're taking testosterone and converting it into estrogen. So here's what's happening. Testosterone is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Testosterone enters the brain. Inside the brain, there is a large amount of this enzyme, aromatase. So the aromatase starts to break down the testosterone. The testosterone breaks down into a few different things, but one of the main metabolites of testosterone is estrogen. So testosterone in the males crosses into the brain, is then broken down into its components, one of which is an estrogen, and the estrogen that is now inside the brain is what masculinizes the individual. Now, this research has been done primarily in rodents and seems to be more true in rodents than it is in other species. So there's still some question as to how much of this actually applies to humans. But this is something that's ongoing. The research here is ongoing, but definitely something that happens in rodents. Now, maybe there's a question that's coming. I'm having to guess what sort of questions you guys might have because I don't have you right in front of me. But maybe there's a question here. If it's actually estrogen in the brain that's masculinizing the individual, then why aren't the females masculinized? Because females have higher levels of estrogen. I'm so glad you asked. Excellent question. Okay, let me get a little caffeine here. Okay, females do not become masculinized, even though they do have estrogen, because estrogen is not able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So, in females, they have the estrogen, but it does not go into the brain because it is bound by something called alpha-fetoprotein. And this alpha-fetoprotein prevents the estrogens from crossing the blood-brain barrier, right? Now, in males, the testosterone that they have crosses the blood-brain barrier and is then broken into estrogen in the brain. With females, because females have lower levels of testosterone, this is not happening as much. And for the estrogen that they already have, it's not allowed to cross the blood-brain barrier. So, in males, you have higher levels of testosterone. The testosterone crosses the blood-brain barrier, and then aromatase breaks it down into different parts, one of which would be an estrogen that then causes what we would consider masculine characteristics in the brain. For females, because females have lower levels of testosterone, more estrogen, the estrogen in their body is not allowed to cross the blood-brain barrier to become estrogen in the brain. It's not allowed to move into the brain. It is kept out by this alpha-fetoprotein. So because of that, once again, basically, we have to have something acting upon the body to make it masculine. The body left alone to its own devices would become feminine. Okay. So let me know if you have questions. Might have to think about that for just a second. Okay, so sexual dimorphism. I think your textbook mentioned that this might have been a Darwin term, perhaps. But with sexual dimorphism, we're talking about basically differences between sexes, between males and females. Now, there are many different things that we could put in this category. Some of this might have to do with physical appearance. We could talk about, external genitalia, that kind of thing. Some of this might have to do with behaviors. I mean, we already said that childbirth is the only behavior that is exclusive to one sex, but there are some differences that we can find on average between males and females when it comes to behavior. So there is that. Also, there could potentially be differences in the brains of males and females as well. So the question then is, imagine that we have found some differences between men and women, behavioral differences, differences in abilities and personalities and preferences. Why are those differences there? On the one hand, we can make an argument that it's because of the presence or absence of testosterone during a sensitive period. We could make a more biological argument. On the other hand, we could make a more nurture sort of argument, more to do with the environment and social influences, what is reinforced, what is punished. Of course, when we're having this nature-nurture discussion, the answer usually falls on both. And I think you'll probably agree with that as we go through and talk about this. There's probably some of both. But we can find some behavioral differences between men and women, remembering that there's only one behavior that is exclusive to one sex, that's childbirth. But there are other behaviors that, on average, are a little bit different. So there's a chart in your textbook here that talks about behavioral characteristics that are different between males and females. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that there is a large individual difference. So just because we might say, on average, men do better on this task and women do better on this task, does not tell you anything about any one particular man or woman. These characteristics might be different on average, but they don't tell you about any one person. There's a lot of individual differences here. So you can look at things. A lot of these, I think, we probably could have guessed from kind of stereotypes here, but the idea that men tend to do better on spatial tasks, so more nonverbal patterns, puzzles, parallel parking, something like that. On the other hand, females tend to do better on verbal tasks, perceptual speed. So perhaps some of this is nature and some of this could be nurture. If females are more reinforced for being more verbal, if they have more opportunities to engage in conversation, then that could be part of the reason why we see a difference here. One thing with math concepts, the research used to show that there was an advantage for males when it comes to math, for more advanced math problems. On basic math, we found kind of equal ability between men and women. For more advanced math, there was sort of an advantage for males. And so your textbook shows kind of that being equal. I think that some of this may have to do with a change in teaching, that perhaps we had teaching that was geared more towards male students than female students here, perhaps. When we talk about personality attributes, we could mention others here as well, but we know that men tend to be more physically aggressive than women. Is that because it's more socially acceptable? Is that because of higher levels of testosterone? It's hard to know for sure. Women tend to have higher levels of empathy, so kind of understanding the feelings of others. We typically talk about in psychology about men having more externalizing disorders and women having more internalizing disorders, that men tend to have more issues with behavior, attention, substance use. Women tend to have more issues with anxiety, depression. My thought is that perhaps we have kind of a universal experience of psychological distress. And then our society, culture, parenting, etc. tells us how to express that psychological distress. And that may be part of the reason why it's different. Okay, there's a lot I could say. I could get off on that, but that's not what we're talking about specifically. Maybe when we get to the disorder, the chapter on disorders, we'll talk more about that. Okay, so your textbook just throws this in here. Many parts of the human brain are sexually dimorphic, and then it doesn't give any specific details on this. There is a picture in your textbook that shows some areas that are considered larger, typically found as being a little bit larger in female brains, and then areas that are a little bit larger in male brains. Suffice it to say that there do tend to be some differences. Of course, then that's a generalization, and each person would have a unique pattern here. But then the question is this an organizational effect from the presence or absence of testosterone during a sensitive period? Or is it possible that the brain is actually changing in size and function because of the environment? We know that this could be the case. We've already talked about neuroplasticity, the idea that high quality parenting or low quality parenting, or exposure to educational opportunities, things can change the makeup of your brain. So it is certainly possible that you see differences in the brains of men and women because they're treated differently. And of course, the answer is probably some of both, some nature and some nurture. Now, one way that we can try to explore this question a little bit is by looking at individuals who have a developmental path that's a little bit different from average. So we talked earlier about androgen insensitive individuals. So these are individuals who have XY chromosomes. So there is a Y chromosome, so there is an SRY gene. The SRY gene causes the indifferent gonads to develop into testes. The testes produce testosterone. But for these individuals, the testosterone receptors are not functioning. Therefore, the testosterone is not able to have its effect. Now, when they do research, you have to remember that these are relatively rare situations. And so when you have a small sample size, it's hard to make a firm statement one way or the other. But what they have found in general is that these individuals tend to have a feminine gender identity. So they would identify as being females. They are more likely to be attracted to men and often express a desire to have children, although that's something that would need to be done through adoption, because these individuals would be infertile. But what we do tend to see here is that these individuals, even though they have a Y chromosome, tend to have a more feminine gender identity. On the other hand, when we look at individuals, we talked earlier about the CAH situation, where an individual has XX chromosomes, and so they do not have the Y chromosome, so they don't have an SRY gene. So then the indifferent gonads develop into ovaries. Without testes to produce testosterone, typically this process would continue in a feminine tract. But what happens is that the adrenal glands start producing testosterone instead of the corticosteroids that they should be producing. So this leads to more masculinization in these individuals. Now, it is true that once the individual is born, then this disorder, this condition can be remedied. So you can give the individual the hormonal treatment at that point. But by that point, development has already progressed pretty far along. So what you find is that these individuals tend to be categorized as more quote unquote tomboys. That's what your textbook talks like. So the people who are around them say these girls tend to play a little bit more rough and tumble, and are more likely to be lesbians than individuals who did not have this disorder, than females who did not. So is this potentially because there was more testosterone in this person's system during a sensitive period? So then this leads us to the question, with the androgen insensitive individuals, they would have the genetic sex that would be XY, that would be considered male, but they identify as more female. Is that because they did not have the testosterone during the sensitive period? On the other hand, for individuals who have XX chromosomes but have high levels of testosterone because their adrenal glands are producing it, are those individuals more likely to be considered more masculine, have more masculine traits? Is that because they had testosterone during that sensitive period? That certainly could be a biological cause. It could also be that they were treated differently, perhaps. With an individual who has that androgen insensitivity disorder, they might have more what we would consider stereotypical, like female appearance. And so that might cause the parenting, the peers, etc., to behave more towards them in a typical feminine pattern. So is it nature or is it nurture? It could be either. It's probably a combination of both. But then this brings us back to our discussion of individuals who have this situation is called webidoses. Once again, I'm not 100% sure that pronunciation is correct. It's probably not. But that's what it would be called in that area in the Dominican Republic. So these are individuals who have XY chromosomes, they have SRY genes, they have testes that produce testosterone, but then the enzyme that takes that testosterone and converts it into a more powerful form is not present. So the individual does not have that full external masculinization of the external genitals. So what we see here is that these individuals are typically viewed as being females when they're born, and they have an intersex appearance for their, external genitals. But then when they reach puberty, then we typically see an increase in testosterone that leads to more masculinization of the genitals. And at that point, they're typically treated as males. So why does this progress in this fashion? Well, on the one hand, you might say these individuals have XY chromosome. So they have testes that produce testosterone. So they were exposed to testosterone during that important sensitive period. And because of that, then their brain was masculinized, right? That process, aromatization, the brain was masculinized so that when they hit puberty, that was sort of a second sensitive period, and they progressed in a more masculine fashion as far as development goes. So it is possible that it just had to do with the presence of testosterone during that sensitive period. Remember, with these individuals, testosterone's there, testosterone's working, receptors are working. The problem is that the testosterone is not able to be converted into its more powerful form. Okay? On the other hand, it could be that it's not so much nature as it is nurture. In this culture, they have a category for this, that some individuals will be born and treated as females, but then later in life, when they hit puberty, will begin to have more of what's considered masculine behaviors and characteristics. And there's just a social category for this. And because of that, the environmental influence is part of what leads to this developmental path. Very likely, it's probably both, right? So it's not just whether you have testosterone present or absent during a sensitive period. It's also how you're being influenced by the environment around you. So there's probably some influence of both nature and nurture here. Okay, one other situation that your textbook briefly mentions here, colloquial extrapy. So this refers to genetic boys born with testes but without penises. Okay, so when we say genetic boys, what we mean is As far as genetic sex, these individuals have XY chromosomes, which then leads to the SRY gene and testes and testosterone, but they do not have a penis. Now, this is all your textbook really says about this, but what you should be aware of is that usually there are a lot of other problems as well. This is not simply a situation where we have a healthy individual that's missing a penis. This is more like there are a lot of internal issues with internal organs. So this person would probably have to have a series of surgeries after birth to repair issues with internal organs as well. In addition to that, and more relevant to this current conversation, these are individuals who are genetically male but born without penises. So then a really difficult situation arises for a parent to try to make a decision while we're already doing the surgery to try to fix the internal organ issues. Should we also do a sex reassignment surgery here where we would give the individual what would be typically considered female genitalia, and then raise that individual as a girl? Certainly there's concerns here either way, and this is, a really difficult decision to make. And for some individuals, they might say, well, this is not a decision that we're going to make right now, fix the internal issues, and then we can make this decision later down the road with input from the child as well. But certainly this is a rare disorder, so there's not very many cases, so there's not a lot of research on it. But in the little bit of research that your textbook talks about, they followed up with people who had this disorder, and then they had that sex reassignment surgery to give them what would typically be considered female genitals. And they found that for some of those individuals, they identified as being a male, even if they didn't know about the condition that they had had at birth. Some of them identified as being a male, but there were others who identified as a female and did not feel that there was something off with their gender. So certainly there is no solid right answer here, and it would be a really difficult decision for a parent to make. Okay, last topic that your chapter really focuses on here has to do with sexual orientation. So up until this point, we've been talking about sexual differentiation. We talked a little bit about gender, thinking about the difference between sex and gender, sex being more based on biology, chromosomes, gender being more based on society, influences, cultural norms, etc. Here, when we're talking about sexual orientation, we're talking about what gender an individual is attracted to. So a lot of research has been done in this area, and I'm sure more research is continuing. Basically, though, as with most of the topics we've talked about, it comes down to nature versus nurture. And then the answer is just about always both. And the same is true here as well. So on the one hand, we could think about nurture. As far as who we're attracted to, you could think about, your textbook talks about society's instructions. So role models, parenting, peers, media, etc. could fall in this category. On the other hand, we could be looking at biological differences. A lot of the research here has been similar to some of the research we've already been discussing. The idea that exposure to testosterone during a sensitive period might be influential as far as what sort of sexual orientation a person might have. So, has research shown differences in brain structures between individuals of different sexual orientations? Yes. One thing I want to say before I go further here, the slides use the term homosexuals, and the textbook uses the term homosexuals. I think it's important to note here that different individuals have different preferences on terms, and that it's a good idea to just kind of check in and see what sort of terms a person is comfortable with. I have met gay individuals who preferred the term gay because they felt like there was a stigma associated with homosexual. But I have also had some gay individuals or say they would prefer to be referred to as homosexual. So there are different terms, and I think it would be respectful just to ask a person, what term they prefer. The reason the textbook includes homosexual, so that's why the slides that come with the textbook include the term homosexual. But just being aware that there are different terms and trying to find out what term an individual would prefer. So when we're looking at differences in brain structures, it talks here about the INAH3 nucleus of the POA. That's a part of the hypothalamus. That's really what we're talking about here. You don't need to know all the specific details. It's part of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus we'll talk more about in the next chapter, about how it impacts your body temperature and hunger and thirst and sleep and sexual activity as well. So in this particular structure in the hypothalamus, this area was larger in men than in women and larger in heterosexual men than in gay men. Now, when you see the term nucleus, the nucleus was larger. Remember here that in the central nervous system, the term nucleus is referring to a collection of neurons, right? So this area was larger in men and then larger in heterosexual men than in gay men. Now, this was not showing much of a difference between heterosexual women and lesbians. So this is something that was more specifically showing a difference in males. Now, the question then is it possible that here we have a structure that's different that causes a person to have a particular type of sexual orientation? It's possible. Or is it that a person has a sexual orientation for any number of other nature and nurture reasons, and then that causes a change in the brain? That's also possible. Could be a third variable causing both. Certainly, when we think about a correlation, all we know is that there is a relationship here. We don't know the direction of the correlation. And this would have to be a correlation. This is not something that we can do an experiment on. We can't randomly assign a person to a particular sexual orientation. I apologize if you guys can hear my kids in the background. My kids are in another room with my husband, and at any point they may come banging on the door. All right, so we said that for that structure in the hypothalamus, it didn't show that much of a difference between heterosexual women and lesbians. Are there some structures that do show differences here? So you don't need to know, exactly what all these terms are referring to. Basically, what we're saying is that there's differences in autoacoustic emissions, so kind of like ringing in the ears, eye blink, skeletal features. Basically, in women who had these markers, who were indicated that they had had more exposure to testosterone during a sensitive period, they were more likely to be lesbians than individuals who did not have these markers of extra testosterone. Now, one thing to note is that there was a difference between heterosexual females and lesbians as groups. But that does not mean that there's a difference for any one particular individual. You cannot use this to figure out whether or not a woman is gay. And it didn't show any difference between gay and straight men, so this was something that was unique to women. When it talks about finger length patterns, okay, I don't expect you to know the details of this because I always get confused myself here. They compared your index finger and your ring finger. And if I can remember this correctly, the heterosexual women who were not having the markers of being exposed to more testosterone had ring fingers and index fingers that were more the same length, versus for women who had been exposed to more testosterone, their index fingers were a little bit shorter than their ring fingers. I think this is right. I don't expect you to know this. There's not going to be any test questions about this, but just kind of explaining what the slide's talking about here. Now, you cannot use that to predict any one person's sexual orientation. Okay, but just on average, there's a difference. Okay. One other thing, when we're looking at gay men, we can see a difference here in the number of brothers born before that individual. So, fraternal birth order effect. All right, now, this is pretty specific, limited only to right-hand boys. But if a male had had several older brothers that had been born to the same mother before him, then there was an increased likelihood that that individual would be gay. Now, there are then questions that you might have, like, is this nature or is this nurture? Is it that having older brothers makes a person more likely to be gay? But what they did was they looked at this with individuals who'd been adopted. So the individual did not have biological older brothers. They just had like adopted or step older brothers, that kind of thing. And they did not have this increased likelihood of being gay. And then they looked at individuals who had older biological brothers, but didn't live with those older biological brothers, and they still had an increased likelihood of being gay. So this probably has to do with something with mother's testosterone levels, perhaps. You can see here now this probability, it doesn't change that much, but there is a slight increase here for right-handed individuals, and then for non-right-handed individuals, we did not see an increase in the probability. What do I mean by non-right-handed? Well, there's some people who are left-handed and some people who are ambidextrous, use both hands equally. So this was only true in right-handed individuals. Okay, so that is all of the material for exam 2. Now, so exam 2 is going to cover our chapters on chemistry, so chapter 4, chapter 7 on the development of the nervous system, and then chapter 12 on sex. So remember that the format for exam 2 is going to be the same as exam 1. There'll be the multiple choice, true, false, and fill in the blank questions. Canvas will grade your test after you take it, but then I will go back in to make sure that everyone got the appropriate number of points for the fill in the blank and the extra credit. So there will be that extra credit essay question. It asks you to list things that you've learned in this section of the class that were not included on the test. Now, one thing to just kind of clarify on that, I give 1 point per fact. The fact needs to be A, not on the test, and B, so don't just take something straight from the test, and B, an accurate fact that you learned in this section. And so you can get up to 4 points from doing this, 1 point per fact. If you're not sure about some of your facts, then you could put more than 4 just to increase the likelihood that I can find 4 to give you full credit for that, okay? There is a study guide that is posted for you in Canvas. Please feel free to email me if you have questions as you are preparing for exam 2. So remember that exam 2 is going to open right after our typical class time on February 18th, and then it'll close right before our class time on the following Thursday, which would be February 25th. Once you start taking it, you'll have 75 minutes to take it. You'll need to take it in one setting. And in other words, once you start it, you'll need to finish it. And then I'm fine with you using your notes and your textbook. If you have the textbook, please do not use each other or other internet sources. So if you have questions, please let me know. I'm going to end the video here, but I am available through email if you need anything. Remember that we're not going to meet for class on February 23rd because I'm giving you that time to take the test if you would like. So you guys take care, and I hope to see you on the 25th.